the different chapters we present are like our country movements are Greece, Spain, and Occupy, or Greece, Spain, and the US as like the most recent movements, but we root a lot of the practices back in different Latin American movements from the late 80s on, 90s, etc. So we also have one chapter on Venezuela and one on Argentina. And we have at the beginning a chapter like called Grounding the New Globally, where we like make up these connections to like movements that existed before in Argentina and Venezuela, in Chiapas, the Zapatistas, and the MST in Brazil, etc., that have very similar practices as the new movements have. That does not mean, and I think that's important, that the new movements copied these things or these practices from Latin America, but it shows how global capitalism, neoliberal politics have created very similar needs all over. And we can see needs and also how people feel like, and especially this rejection of representative democracy as not democratic is something that is a very strong common feature between all these Latin American movements and the new movements globally. And we sometimes talk about the second wave of non-representative protests or rejection of representative democracy. And the thing about democracy is the second big chapter in the book. It's on one hand about how can we situate like the question of representative democracy, and what are the new practices created by these movements that are in response to this rejection, like setting up all different kinds of experiments how democracy can work differently. And it's important also to say that there are differences all over, even if there is this common rejection, but there are differences all over, and it has to be like that, otherwise it wouldn't be democratic. Just to make a short example, I lived for quite a long time, always about half a year, like during almost 10 years, more than 10 years in Venezuela, always like 4 to 8 months a year. And I worked, for example, in different neighborhoods from 2005 on, helping to create local self-administration in the so-called consejos comunales. And it was a very interesting experience in the sense that you could go to a neighborhood really up in the mountains, like in a really poor, very poor neighborhood. That's especially when you can see them on the cover of a film I did, and this is outside. And if you have an assembly there and 25 people assist, the next day 300 will know what they've been talking about. You do the same thing down in this inner city area where people think they're middle class, even if economically they're not much better off than the people on the hill, but obviously they have more access to infrastructure, etc. But their model, how they live, is much more like our model. Like when they close the door, they live inside their apartment, they have small families. It's not like in the barrio, in the poor neighborhood, where you have huge families, you live outside, you talk with everyone you walk by, because it's mainly steps. There's one main road and the rest is steps. So you have to walk by and say hello to everyone every day. You don't just drive by with the car and stop and go up to your apartment. If you have an assembly with 25 people in this neighborhood, the next day 20 will know what they talked about, because they have the same problems as we have. That many people feel alone, so they just go to these assemblies to see other people, but not even because they're really interested or they are following, etc. So obviously, the models of democratic participation have to be different even in these two different neighborhoods in one city. Otherwise, if they're the same, it wouldn't be a democracy. But so the feeling that came up, I think, very strongly, and it's also expressed in a lot of the slogans, like from Spain, Democracia Real, yeah, real democracy now, or they cannot represent us was a slogan all over, shows how the crisis has intensified this feeling, or many times revealed to people that they don't have anything to say and no influence at all in what's happening in their life or with them. If they have a job or not, if they lose it or not, if they can send their kids to school or not, if they can go to university, if politicians do what they've been elected for, etc., etc., etc. And that's a feeling that is, I think, very common and shared from like the 80s in Venezuela to the uprisings in Argentina in the 2000s, from the Zapatistas and then up to wherever, Spain and Russia and Portugal and the US in Occupy. And it shows, I think, the end of an era, the clear end of the idea that representative democracy or liberal democracy is a space where we can still gain rights. And I think it's important to notice that if we look how even the fathers of the liberal democracy define liberal democracy, and I say fathers because it's very interesting that liberal democracy has only fathers, no mothers. So
theorists of participatory democracy are generally women.
In a lot of cases, women, yes, not all, but yeah. But it's very interesting how the liberal democracy was born without any mother, and but if we look at it, like people like, let me have a look. Is it here? Sorry, I have to look for it. Yes. Schumpeter is obviously one of the fathers of the modern liberal democracy, and he's very clear about how democratic liberal democracy or representative democracy is, much clearer than anything we've been told after Schumpeter. He says, first of all, according to the view we have taken, democracy does not mean and cannot mean that the people actually rule in any obvious sense of the terms people and rule. Democracy means only that the people have the opportunity of accepting or refusing the men who are to rule them by means of free competition among would-be leaders for the vote of the electorate. Democracy is the rule of the politician. The voters outside parliament must respect the division of labor between themselves and the politicians they have elected. They must understand that once they have elected an individual, political action is his business and not theirs. So it's interesting how even if it's defined so clearly, we've been told from school to the media all the time that like liberal democracy is the democracy. I mean, it's not even a question. It's not even called anymore representative or liberal democracy, but it's just democracy. Like it's the only democracy that is supposed to exist. We have to say that during a few decades, it was a frame to gain more rights, without any doubt. But we have also to see that these rights that are supposed to be part of liberal democracy are not part of liberal democracy. They were gained in struggles. Liberal democracy lived very well for a lot of time with having people, rich people, like 6 or 8 votes and the poor ones none. Liberal democracy had no problem that women weren't allowed to vote. Liberal democracy had no problem that you could buy and sell humans. So we see that liberal representative democracy is not a democracy that includes these rights, but they have been gained by people in struggles against the liberal democracy or the main thought. And if we look at history, it's very obvious because liberals and Democrats were enemies for hundreds of years. Liberals rejected democracy and Democrats rejected liberalism. When did it come together? Well, when it could be the democracy was limited to a so-called political sphere. So when it was out of question that economy is not a scenario where there would be any democracy nor the social sphere, but just this supposed representative political sphere. So I think that then from the 80s on, we experienced that that liberal democracy is not anymore the space to gain rights, but the space where they try to reduce your rights and you try to keep some of the rights or you gained in the 100 years before, but it's more and more difficult. And the crisis made it very obvious for everyone that this is not anymore a frame where people can in any way participate in what concerns their lives directly. So that's why all these movements came up. And just to end, I think the very important thing also that she said is about the goals without demands, in a sense that it's not that people don't want the state to do something, but it's the long experience that whatever they want from the state, it doesn't do it anyway. So it's about taking the action first, not setting up the demand, oh, please don't evict my neighbor, and then we wait if they evict them or not, but it's going there and block the eviction. 2 days ago, just as to add something to this wave, women, how you call with children that are that don't have a husband or that are alone with children. Single mothers, yeah, sorry. Single mothers in London that have been foreclosed and evicted from their houses occupied a whole block altogether. In Italy, this is happening in that families and mothers and migrants occupy whole blocks. Happened in Rome and Turin and Naples and in Milan and in other cities. In Sabadell, which is a satellite city of Barcelona, the anti-foreclosure movement got a whole block they had occupied assigned, I think, 2 weeks ago. In one recuperated factory, and that's another phenomena that starts to exist in Europe. In like there are 2 occupied factories in France, 1 in Greece, 2 in Italy, 1 in Turkey. Before that, they existed only in Latin America, but it starts there. And we visited 1 in Milan in the end of June, and had a talk with a worker that explained very well what it means, these goals without demands, and what's the idea behind it. He said, okay, we want a law that assigns to the workers, once the factories have been abandoned by the bosses, that assigns the workers the factories because they can do something with them. But who are we going to ask for this law? Should we ask the parliament, the party, or the president? I mean, no one will answer. The only thing we can do is we can set up a movement that is so strong that it will force them to give us the factories. And if we discussed it in our assembly and we looked at history, how are laws made up? And we noticed laws, it's not that first there is a law and then people do what the law says. It's that first there is a practice, and then the state always comes up to regulate something that already exists. That has been like that with everything. So if we want this law, what we have to do is take over factories all over, and then someone will come up and legalize it, because the state always wants to legalize and norm and regulate everything. But our thing is, we start now taking over factories so that someday, if enough people do that, there will be a law. So that's the idea, I think, that shows very clearly what is about goals without demands. It's not that people don't want to relate to the state, or they don't care or ignore the state. They've been ignored by the state, so they choose a social practice to force the authorities to do something as a response. Okay, thank you.